Thank you all very much for being here and sharing your deep knowledge in this area. This first session is one where we will try, as the title is called, Setting the Scene. I mean, we're prosaic, to the point. This session is designed to set the scene, and our speakers have all got deep expertise in the sort of data and information about the nature of the society at the moment. So I won't introduce them at length because their bios are in the program and you can see them, I think, on the screens, which I trust are working. But first, what I think I'll do is I'll just introduce you all, and then you can each come up one after the other, and then we'll do a question time after that, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience as well. So the speakers are Richard Holden, who's the President of the Academy of Social Sciences, Alison, who's a Deputy Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Kalinda Griffiths, who's from the Big Data Research Centre at the University of New South Wales, and James O'Donnell, who's a lead in the ANU's Social Cohesion project. So over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Julianne, for that introduction and for your excellent opening remarks, to Stephen and Susan for your role in organising today, and all the others who've put so much work into this, and for the Royal Society generally for organising this wonderful event about a very important issue. And I'm very pleased to be able to be here. I have the unenviable task of kicking this off, so I'm going to provide a very high-level overview. So if I could just get my slides up on the screen, perhaps? Okay, and I will just make sure I know how to use the clicker. Here we go. All right, so I'm just going to, as I say, give a very brief overview of, I think, touching on a number of the issues that the fantastic panels are going to talk about in more detail later on. I won't cover everything. I'm an economist for my sins. I'm an economist by training and by profession, and so I'll have a slightly sort of economistic lens on these things, but you know, I think it's important to put some of these things in context. So I'll talk about living standards, inequality, our educational outcomes in the context of those around the world, something briefly about health, and then just offer a couple of quick thoughts on some challenges ahead. So if you look at this as, you know, there's going to be sort of a barrage of data, and I apologise for that. If you look at one measure, there's a lot of discussion these days about wellbeing budgets and other things, but you know, GDP per capita isn't the be-all and end-all, and Bobby Kennedy was very eloquent about this a long time ago, but it is a measure of what makes a whole lot of social programs and social progress possible. So it's not, if you have to look at one thing, it's not a bad touchstone for that. And you can see Australia is, you know, a very wealthy country. There are some sort of odd outliers there with some, you know, sort of countries with very large financial sectors or very large natural resources relative to the size of their populations. Australia is a wealthy country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and that's a product of, you know, a very, very long history. We're not speaking of well-being type measures. You know, long ago, Amartya Sen, who I had the great fortune of being taught by when I was a PhD student at Harvard, you know, sort of, I guess, operationalised Robert Kennedy's point and was instrumental in helping set up the UN Human Development Index, which, as many people in this room know better than I do, takes account of a number of other indicators of well-being and progress in society. And we're not only a wealthy country, we're a society that does very well on the sort of composite measure of how we do. So there's a lot of things we've got going for us, and there's a lot of things that we've done well. There's a lot of talk around the world, and there has been for a considerable period of time, about rising inequality, and that's a very important concern and something that I think everyone takes seriously. I think it's also important to remember that that narrative, which applies extremely strongly to places like the United States and some other jurisdictions, isn't completely absent in Australia, but we're a bit different. And so this is one measure of inequality, the Gini index, where a higher measure means a higher number means more unequal, and a lower measure means less unequal. And you can see that this moves around over time, but over the last 2 decades or so, there's not a lot of discernible evidence that Australia has become more unequal in our distribution of income, at least measured in that way. Now that, I think, emphatically does not mean that those who are the least well off in society are well off. This doesn't speak to the ingoing level of inequality. Maybe the starting number was far too high. But it does say that we are doing something to buck the trends that are going on in certain other parts of the world. And I'd point out also, this is a number before our tax and transfer system. And for all the discussion about it, we do have one of the most progressive tax systems in the world, and we do have one of the most effective transfer systems in the world. And I think that's something that underpins the social contract in Australia. There's always more work to do on that. I write very often in my column in the Australian Financial Review about ways to reform the tax system and to improve the outcomes of the least fortunate members of society. But it's important to remember that our starting point, at least in global context, is not that bad. Now, you might ask, where do we fit in the world on this? And we're roughly speaking in the middle of the pack. So we're not the most egalitarian society in terms of income distribution in the world, but we're also not up there with the United States or Mexico or some of those other countries. So I make no judgment about whether that's a good number or a bad number, whether we should be doing better or we should be satisfied, but that's where we are. Now, again, I'm an economist, so let me offer a few observations about what actually drives income. And I think it's important to remember as we think about what kind of investments we need to make in our future, that incomes at a very broad level are driven by physical capital and they're driven by human capital. That's what makes society wealthy and allows it to allocate resources to important social and cultural causes. And one of the great lessons of economics over the past 20 or 30 years is that there are very high and increasing returns to human capital. You know, another way of saying it, as one famous economist said, is people get paid their skill, or if you like, people get paid for their skill. Now, there are some important exceptions to that when government pays for things. So I'm not saying that nurses and teachers and frontline workers aren't underpaid, but I am saying that in general, on average, over the long run in the private sector, people tend to get rewarded for their human capital. And that puts a very high premium on making sure that people from all backgrounds have access to great skills training. That can be skills training in high school, that can be skills training at TAFE, that can be at one of our great universities around the country. But it does mean that the skills that people learn and continue to refine over a lifetime are increasingly and extremely important to their material outcomes. And our ability to be able to tax and transfer to improve the outcomes of people who, for one reason or another, are not able to avail themselves of those training programs and education. So the bottom line is, if we want people to earn more, we need to provide people with more human capital. It's been commented a lot in the press that Australia's education system is in some form of crisis. I don't think it's quite as dramatic as that. And I have a report coming out in a few weeks, partnering with the McKell Institute, about education in Australia and in New South Wales in particular. One thing that's often said is that our PISA scores, our sort of scores of 15-year-olds' problem-solving skills have been declining over time. And I'll just make one observation here, which is that our NAPLAN scores, our basic skills testing, while they're important, there's important heterogeneity, there's important difference between the highest performing students and the least well-performing students, that our basic skills have tended to be quite stable over time, at least on average. But our performance at the sort of 15-year-old level, at the problem-solving level, taking those basic skills and putting them to work in the kind of things that help people solve problems, if you like, when they get out, beyond the educational system into the community, those seem to be suffering in absolute terms, and even more so relative to various other countries around the world, in the OECD and in Southeast and in non-OECD Southeast Asian countries. And that's something that I think we will need to continue to be focused on. I've written about many times. Some of the solutions to those things are very well known from evidence overseas. Some of those things cost quite a lot of money. High-dose tutoring is one of the most effective educational interventions you've seen anywhere in the world, and there's fantastic causal evidence from randomised controlled trials on the impact of that. That's expensive. A whole range of other interventions to do with the curriculum, about standards, about discipline, are approximately free. And so I think this sort of false dichotomy between saying either we need a ton more money in education or no more money in education is not right. Overall, we're basically now in the middle of the pack when it comes to these educational outcomes for 15-year-olds. And back to my earlier slide that made the claim that a lot of what drives material outcomes for people and for society generally is returns to human capital. We're slipping in terms of human capital in absolute, or the drivers and inputs to human capital in absolute terms and relative terms. And that's a challenge that I think we need to confront. I think in terms of our healthcare system, there's a lot of very positive things to like about our healthcare system. That red dot there, each dot here represents a country, and that's a scatter plot of life expectancy versus the amount, the share of the economy, the share of GDP we spend on, various countries spend on the health system at a general level. Australia has spending at a little under 10% of GDP and has among the best health outcomes in the world. And I think that's a testament to the carrots and sticks, the design and the universality of our healthcare system. And as someone who spent a decade living in the United States, I can assure you, you don't want to trade the Australian healthcare system for the US healthcare system. So I think there are a number of challenges ahead as I just finish up here. And again, these are things that I harp on about a lot in my newspaper column, but our tax mix is quite inefficient by global standards. We rely very heavily on income taxes and not a lot on consumption taxes. Rosalind Dixon, who's a law professor at UNSW and also has the misfortune to be my wife, and I have proposed for many years the idea of a progressive GST, that we can get more money from consumption taxes, but by giving every Australian adult a $10,000 GST-free threshold, which can be done very efficiently through our world-class payment system, we could move a little away from income taxes, a little more to consumption taxes, and still make more than the bottom 50% of Australians better off as a result of that. The GST doesn't have to be regressive. We have, as I said, educational outcomes that are in some ways declining. There is a strong overseas evidence based on what to do, but no clear consensus in Australia on how to fix it. And my small contribution to that has been to establish a group at UNSW to focus more on providing evidence through randomised controlled trials and other means of what works in education from a causal perspective. You know, if we do more of this in education, will we get better educational outcomes? And as has been commented on, the NDIS is an incredibly important part of our social contract. It's an incredibly important part of providing dignity to some of the least fortunate members of our community. But it is growing. It will cost, according to the current budget, and I was in the lockup, more than $100 billion in a decade's time and consume 2.5% of GDP. And we need to have a national discussion about how to deal with that and how to pay for it and get all the important things that we get from the NDIS while not having to give up on a whole lot of the other parts of our welfare state. And as you know, I wouldn't have put this slide up if I'd heard Stephen's admonition about not plugging one's own book. But in the unlikely event you want to hear or read anything more about my views on these topics, Rosalind and I have a book to that effect. They make great Christmas presents. Thank you again.
Thank you, Richard. And that's opened up a whole lot of the framing for the discussion that we will continue both now and over the rest of the day. So, Alison.
Thanks, Julianne, and thanks for having me here today. Thanks for the invitation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present, and also to affirm my commitment and the commitment of the team in PM&C to practically applying that recognition to the work that we do on a daily basis. So I feel affirmed by some of the things that Richard has mentioned that does align with what I was going to talk about here today. I want to acknowledge that despite decades of economic success in Australia, many Australians continue to face entrenched and complex disadvantage. And disadvantage can significantly affect an individual's social and economic engagement. There's growing evidence that growing up in disadvantage can significantly impact a child's neurological development in ways we had not contemplated before. With increasing geographic concentration of disadvantage, it can lead to deep-seated social impacts and threaten social cohesion, something we often take for granted here in Australia. And to acknowledge from the government's perspective that existing approaches to address disadvantage have not often worked, often resulting, in fact, in the entrenchment of disadvantage. After briefly reviewing our progress towards addressing entrenched disadvantage, I will give my take on past approaches and how they might be better directed. We clearly need to rethink the way we develop and implement policy. I think there are good reasons the current government might place a greater focus on place-based initiatives, community-driven initiatives, policy co-designed with the people it affects most, and greater use of monitoring and evaluation to support continual learning and ensure policy is directed to where it's most effective. But at its heart, government, communities, providers and individuals all need to work better together and differently together as partners. Some degree of equality, we know, in society is inevitable, arising due to differences in ability, opportunity, effort and luck. But policy has the power to increase or reduce inequality. Inequality is typically best addressed through an efficient, progressive tax and highly targeted transfer system, as Richard has referred to. Prior to the pandemic, Australia experienced almost 3 decades of continuous economic growth, which led to significant improvement in living standards. Over these 30 years, income inequality in Australia rose only slightly. As highlighted by the Productivity Commission, unlike the US and UK, over the period from the 1980s to the mid-2010s, Australia enjoyed high income growth across all income deciles, with notably stronger growth in the bottom decile. In large part, this is due to Australia's progressive tax and highly targeted transfer system, which substantially reduces the degree of income inequality. And consumption inequality can also be a better measure, as it more directly relates to an individual's welfare. In Australia, consumption inequality is around 30% lower than income inequality, when in-kind government transfers such as education, health and public housing are included in people's consumption. Income is not the only relevant measure of well-being. Others include wealth and life expectancy, but I won't go into those ones today. I want to talk a bit more about entrenched disadvantage. Many Australians experience economic disadvantage at some stage in their life, but for some, and for most, in fact, it's temporary. Traditional measures of income and consumption inequality provide a snapshot at a point in time. However, arguably most important is the extent to which individuals move across the distribution over their lifetime, what is often termed economic mobility. Economic mobility is high in Australia. Almost everyone moves across the income distribution over the course of their lives, but some Australians experience entrenched disadvantage. In 2018, the Productivity Commission found that around 9% of Australians, that's 2.2 million people, experienced relative income poverty in 2015 and 16, that is income below 50% of the median. This aggregate figure has fluctuated since 1988 and 89, but has not declined. Persistent and recurrent poverty affects a small but significant proportion of the population. About 3% of Australians, roughly 700,000 people, have been living in income poverty continuously. People living in single-parent families, unemployed people, people with disabilities and Indigenous Australians are particularly likely to experience income poverty, deprivation and social exclusion. Living in poverty can constrain a child's development and life prospects and lead to a higher likelihood of entrenched disadvantage. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds are likely to suffer as a result of disrupted schooling that has occurred through COVID-19, as we know from the lockdowns, extended lockdowns, and in different states those have applied differently. The effects on children from disadvantaged backgrounds are amplified by limited access to equipment and support while homeschooling, and research examining school closures in the Netherlands found education losses were up to 60% larger for disadvantaged students. These educational losses are no doubt compounded by impacts on mental health, and you will see and hear continuing work in that regard. I want to pause here to look at past approaches and how they could be better directed in the future. Well-intentioned but poorly targeted policy can not only miss an opportunity to ameliorate disadvantage, but can actually contribute to it. This can include where policies create adverse incentives, are overly complex or hard to engage with, and overreach the role of government or lead to uncertainty and responsibility. People who experience entrenched disadvantage are likely to face multiple barriers and require help in building capabilities. Current policy and fiscal frameworks, which tend to focus on short-term outputs and even worse inputs within a single portfolio, are unlikely to support good policy. Too often, policy focuses on trends and averages, which can often mask important details. For example, while the challenges facing many people experienced entrenched disadvantage may be similar, lived experiences and social and cultural factors vary widely. As a consequence, much policy does not directly target those most in need or tackle the underlying causes of disadvantage, let alone provide the wraparound support that is needed to make a difference. Worse still, blame for the failure of misguided policy is often transferred to individuals and communities, compounding the stigma of disadvantage. Hilary Cottam, author of Radical Help, How We Can Remake the Relationships Between Us and Revolutionise the Welfare State, highlights that supports, systems and the ways we do policy fail to cope with today's challenges because they weren't set up to do so in the first place. On top of the outdated design features of our siloed programmatic approaches to complex and multifaceted disadvantage, Australia also faces an additional challenge to ensure our policy institutions recognise the complex split of responsibilities across Australian governments in our federation. And having attended almost 50 national cabinets at this stage in my life, I see those daily complexities frequently. At the same time, these very same governments have emerged from the COVID pandemic with a changed fiscal reality that demands more efficient and effective spending going forward. Clearly, we need to work better together. Our approaches need to be grounded in this imperative, recognise and learn from past failures, and elevate the role of communities in shaping the support they consider will be most effective for them. This inversion of the policy-making process through community-driven approaches is also what is clearly envisaged and agreed to in the Closing the Gap agreement in 2020 between Australian governments and the Coalition of the Peaks. The priority reforms set out in that agreement enshrine an aspiration for policy for First Nations communities that originates with them and which governments work with them to deliver and implement. So how can we help ensure policy is more effective at tackling entrenched disadvantage? We need to get the fundamentals right. Policy needs to have a long-term, clear strategic focus. It needs to be relevant. That includes co-designed with the people and communities who are directly impacted, with stewardship and accountability for outcomes and impact shared. It needs to support people's capabilities instead of fixing their problems. It needs to be informed by rigorous evidence. It needs to build local capability as well as deliver services. And it needs to support continual learning through credible and transparent monitoring and evaluation. Policies and actions to address entrenched disadvantage are chopped and changed, as has frequently been the case, and implementation has been inconsistent. We too often persist with policies that are not effective or delivering. No single policy, government department, organisation or program can solve the complex programs facing most children and families living in communities where disadvantage is concentrated. We need to better understand the multiple factors that influence and drive entrenched disadvantage, evaluating the impact of policy that may contribute to it. This includes greater focus on the development and use of linked longitudinal data, better data sharing and improved data capability, particularly by government and service providers, and improved monitoring and evaluation systems to be more robust and transparent. I'm going to talk just want to close actually with some examples of some good place-based approaches that have been implemented by the Australian Government and which we would like to build on in time. These place-based or community-driven approaches to policy can support real change. For place-based approaches to be effective, they require an investment in building community capacity and governance and leadership. A partnership between the Murdi-Paki Regional Assembly and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to gather learnings from community-led governance noted the importance of building capability, including to address power imbalance. Greater use of co-designed place-based approaches to policy, including implementation, is producing positive results. There are great examples of success. Stronger Places, Stronger People is a community-led collective impact initiative stewarded by the Commonwealth in partnership with state and territory governments. At its heart, the initiative draws on data and evidence to inform where we need to invest, working with communities, facilitating more inclusive engagement, joint decision-making, governance and local action. Earlier this year, I was fortunate to meet the passionate backbone team behind Burnie Works. For over 7 years, Burnie Works has been facilitating a place-based system to create the conditions for positive change in Burnie in northwest Tasmania. Burnie Works is jointly funded by the Tasmanian and Australian governments through the Stronger Places, Stronger People program to invest in collective impact in the area. It facilitates community engagement over issues and priorities, service system issues and opportunities for the community to mobilise on new reforms and investment. Through the Stronger Places, Stronger People program, the Tasmanian Government has engaged Bernie Works on the implementation of the It Takes a Tasmanian Village Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy, and both have recently partnered with SEER Data and Analytics to provide a data sharing platform. This collaboration will assist to build on an informed approach to community building through sharing state and other data. With the Bernie Child and Family Learning Centre, Bernie Works has mobilised community interest and is now working to implement a suite of measures to help with connection, nutrition, caring and moving to support baby and infant physical activity. So in conclusion, disadvantage affects how individuals and their children participate in society. Disadvantage affects an individual's self-esteem and self-confidence, which in turn impacts individual performance. I have references for these that I will provide to Susan after so that she can make this all available. Existing measures to address disadvantage have failed, resulting in the entrenchment of disadvantage for many. If we are to break the cycle and create greater opportunities for social and economic participation, we all need to change the way we think about policy and how it is developed. This will require governments, communities, providers and individuals to work in partnership. Place-based approaches, community-driven approaches, built around genuine partnerships with initiatives co-designed and supported with careful monitoring and evaluation can work. Early interventions to tackle disadvantage can prevent entrenchment, not only providing opportunities for individuals, but reducing costs on health and welfare expenditure and build greater community cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was terrific. I mean, the challenge of what you're describing in terms of turning that policy process around is extraordinary. So all strengths to you. Yeah, good luck. Now, Kalinda.
Thanks, Julianne. And thank you to Stephen and Susan for the invitation to be here today. It is a privilege to be among some of the nation's great thinkers and also our future generation of leaders discussing how we can support developments that better reflect our diversity to drive equality in this country. So, Nai Nilawa Kalinda Griffiths, Nilawa Corpus, Nai Yawu Jandu Jano Bora Bibi. My name is Kalinda Griffiths. I am a proud Yawu woman. My country is in Broome in Western Australia. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we are meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to our elders, those of the past, the present and the future. I just want to raise the story of Cassius Turvey again. He was a Noongar boy who died in an attack on his way home from school. And he was 15 years old and still in his school uniform. Cassius's death has sparked national debate about the reasons why this attack occurred, with politicians and people visible in the public eye commenting on the determinants and the welfare of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and particularly children. I start with this story to address the elephant in the room. Australia is a colonial nation that has resulting tensions with its First Nations peoples. There are ingrained biases, both individual and systemic, that have continued the narrative of the colonised and the coloniser. This has far-reaching impact in regards to current-day health, well-being, culture and economic positionality of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We know that colonisation is bad for our health. The way in which we address these issues requires all of us to do the work, and it requires identifying both where the gaps are and what works towards building a more equitable future in this nation. There has been significant investment into the developments regarding how we better understand and address the health, social and economic gaps experienced by Australia's First Nations peoples. Historically, the first regular collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data was by the Northern Territory Administration on infant mortality back in 1957. But it would be another 16 years in 1973 before the Commonwealth and jurisdictional health ministers would endorse a policy of collecting national Aboriginal health statistics. Despite the 1967 referendum, and changes to Section 157 in the Australian Constitution, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were to be included in the census, no jurisdiction was actively counting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander births or deaths up until almost the mid-1980s. Part of the challenge in the reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and welfare has been that efforts have been patchy and often sometimes reactive. This has resulted in developments lacking consistency over time. This has included efforts such as the Joint Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare unit in Darwin back in 1996, which was to produce biennial publications on the health and welfare of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It would last only 7 years before being disbanded. Back in 1987, Recommendation 49, arising from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths into Custody, stated that proposals for a special national survey covering a range of social, demographic, health and economic circumstances of the Aboriginal population with full Aboriginal participation at all levels should be supported. The ABS developed the first national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander survey in response to this. The purpose of the survey was to provide governments with stronger information base for planning for the empowerment of Australia's Indigenous peoples and for measuring progress in meeting their objectives, aspirations and needs. While there have been a number of iterations of the ABS Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander surveys, and they're still in progress today, I should say, there has been limited information on how the initial purpose of their development has actually worked to empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There have been a number of departments, centres, committees and groups who have focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data and measurement over the years. Unfortunately, there has been limited government support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander oversight in this work. A notable example is that of the 2008 National Indigenous Reform Agreement and the initial Closing the Gap targets. There was extensive criticism regarding the development of these targets occurring without consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There has also been a range of criticism regarding the focus being on the needs of governments rather than the priorities and the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. While measures of life expectancy and school attendance are important, there is also a need to ensure that summary measures reflect those things that matter to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I should note that the Australian government now reports on the refresh targets. And while the Closing the Gap refresh still has a number of criticisms, every policy does, they were led and developed in consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and peak bodies, learning from those criticisms and moving forward. Some of the work undertaken with the International Group for Indigenous Health Measurement has identified a number of considerations in the data, information and reporting pertaining to Indigenous peoples across the globe. Indigenous peoples have the right to be counted and have the right to their values reflected in the data and information pertaining to them. The International Group for Indigenous Health Measurement includes Indigenous data measurement experts from around the globe. It engages in discussions with those people working in official statistics, governments, and international agencies like the United Nations and the OECD. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat. Previous meetings on how to best measure Indigenous health, specifically the impact of colonisation upon health, highlighted the known invisibility of Indigenous peoples in official data collections. The result of which placed an advocated call to international and national statistical agencies to improve global efforts in the collection of Indigenous data. This raised further discussion about how Indigenous peoples are counted and by whom, how human rights are met with regards to the right to be counted as Indigenous peoples, as well as highlighted the quality of the information used to report on Indigenous peoples. Specifically, there were three overarching issues, which are of particular importance in the Australian setting. Firstly, who is counted? And this includes considerations regarding the definitions of Indigenous peoples and the operationalisation of those definitions, as well as the propensity to identify. Australia has done quite well in terms of the development of the 1978 Commonwealth definition and the resultant standard Indigenous question that was implemented in 1996. And it's supposed to be a requirement for all government services to ask this question. There is a very real challenge in capturing the heterogeneity of indigeneity as well. The majority of the 25% increase of Indigenous identification in the 2016 census was across the east and south coasts, highlighting that individuals are coming into their identities. It also lets us know that colonisation has worked. But these newly identifying individuals may have very different lived realities to those people on communities or to those who grew up in missions. This is a consideration for all outcome measures, particularly in regards to any sharp improvements to mortality or life expectancy estimates. I also want to know that GST distribution as well is based upon census counts. So if we have an increase across those east coasts, if there's limited increases across those northern and western coasts, we aren't going to see that distribution go up to those people who may need it the most. The second issue was how many people are counted. This includes issues of the completeness of the coverage and accuracy of the enumeration, so the counts, as well as the methodologies used by national statistical agencies to address the under and over counts. This has important implications for data sharing and where information regarding Indigenous identifiers sit. The post-enumeration survey is used by the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, to address over and under counts in the census, where enhancement methods for other data sets such as hospitalisations and deaths data can improve Indigenous status for general reporting. There are a range of legal and ethical considerations in the sharing of data that also require our attention. It is worth noting that there has been quite extensive movement in this area, with the ONDC, the Office of the National Data Commissioner, being developed so that we can share data across governments. And thirdly, what is counted and measured, which involves the development of indicators and measures that encompass Indigenous people's states of events, values and understandings. This is a critical issue, with requirement for Indigenous voices to lead in their developments. It also requires valorisation. This would require systems and services valuing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of being, knowing and doing. The last several years has seen major advances in the considerations regarding the measurement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing. We've seen projects such as the What Matters study and the development of the My Kauai study, led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to provide tools to measure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing. While they provide culturally competent, evidence-based approaches for addressing the social and cultural determinants of health and wellbeing, they are not supported as government programs and are reliant upon research funding for their continuity. It's obvious there's a requirement for developments in data, information and measurement to support the health, cultural, social and economic aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be driven by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I don't mean to be doing this alone though. You know, we need all hands on deck. It is not feasible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to do all of the work. One example is the Indigenous Data Network. The Indigenous Data Network works to engage with and leverage international leading developments in the data sciences to maximise the collection, access and use of data resources for community empowerment. It functions as providing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations to that research expertise to facilitate their data priorities, supporting access to the data held by others, including governments, and to build data capacity within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across Australia. There are a range of challenges when it comes to data sharing capabilities across governments and other sectors. Of particular interest is how communities and community-controlled sectors gain that access to that data and information, primarily for nation building. There is a need to develop mechanisms to enable Indigenous voices to guide decision-making regarding data, information as well as that measurement and reporting. Additionally, there's a need for systems to support the continuity of routine reporting for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prioritised measures. Without these mechanisms or processes within the Australian governments, it can be easily perceived as a system that could be abrogating responsibility when it comes to ensuring the rights and responsibilities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities are met through that appropriate and accurate reporting. There is a lot of work to do. As we look to the future, driving First Nations voices to be enshrined in the Constitution through the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it may support one of the major parts of the puzzle when it comes to how we can improve routine reporting on the health and welfare of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. This requires recognition of who the authority is in regards to decisions being made on and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as those developments to support governance processes that will enact these authorities. We need to be thinking about who speaks on behalf of whom. I'll just finish here that it is a requirement that we work together towards a shared goal of self-determination, there's that term again, in the support of an equitable Australia. It's the only way that we can get things done. Thanks.
Thank you, Kalinda. I mean, that is such an important reminder as we go into this session that data is not neutral, that its collection is not something which happens like rainwater falling from the sky. Decisions are made about what data to collect, how to aggregate it, and how to use it. And that's a really crucial element in framing these discussions. So thank you. James.
Thank you, Julianne. Thank you, Kalinda. So, is Australia a cohesive nation? So we've heard a bit about social cohesion already this morning. So what do we mean by it? Well, are we connected to each other? Do we feel we belong? Do we trust one another? Are we engaged in our communities? On some measures, and in the aggregate, we are cohesive. Internationally, Australia scores highly on the degree to which we trust one another and feel pride in our nationality. That's at least compared with other developed countries. I'd say particularly what Professor Holden was talking about that economic development and that relative, I wouldn't say lack of inequality, but that somewhat lower level of inequality than comparable countries is perhaps a big part of that. But we know those inequalities do exist. So in light of what we know about these inequalities, and in light of what we've heard on economic disadvantage from Alison, and what we've heard on Indigenous disadvantage from Kalinda, can we really say that we are cohesive? Can we be cohesive as a country where our First Nations peoples, on average, live 8 to 9 years shorter than the rest of us? Where by some measures, more than 1 million people have been homeless for at least some point in their lives? Where 1 in 3 people from non-English speaking backgrounds feel they've been discriminated against over a 12-month period. Or where people in the most disadvantaged communities in Australia were 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than people in the most affluent communities. These are genuine questions. I don't have the answers. If it were possible to construct a world league table ranking Australia on a set of these measures, I think Australia would do a reasonable job. And we see that with things like the Human Development Index, where we score reasonably higher. But that is really little comfort to the people that experience that disadvantage. And that disadvantage is extraordinarily detrimental to their sense of belonging, their sense of connectedness in Australia, and detrimental then to social cohesion as a whole in Australia. So I've heard a little bit from Her Excellency about the Mapping Social Cohesion survey by the Scanlon Foundation. So this year I have taken over as the lead author of the Scanlon Foundation's Mapping Social Cohesion study. Since its inception in 2007, it has been led by Professor Andrew Marcus. Professor Marcus is retiring this year and put me in the hot seat. It's a big job, but an exciting one, and we have a launch of the 2022 report on the 23rd of November. So I encourage you to put that in your calendars, and where a lot of what I'll say today will take on increased meaning significance. I am also a demographer and lecturer at the Australian National University. And as a demographer, it's really incumbent on me, and in fact a requirement of the discipline, that I set the scene a little bit by sharing some population statistics with you. So at least leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Australian population grew rapidly. So over the last 50 years, the population doubled. And over the last 20 years, we've added about 330,000 people per year, which used to be about the size of Canberra not long ago, but Canberra has also grown rapidly. And that rate of population growth over the last 20 years makes Australia one of the fastest growing developed countries in the world, behind only the likes of Singapore and Luxembourg and some of the Gulf states. Whether the level of population growth has been good or bad, generally depends on your perspective, but it has unmistakably changed the characteristic of our communities. In a place like Sydney, we've had a very large increase in the number of people living in apartment buildings, for instance. In places like Melbourne, where they haven't seen that increase in apartment buildings, they've continued to grow outwards. And the big concern around cohesion for those communities popping up on the outskirts is how they're connected across the city and within and across their communities. Immigration, that hasn't come through very well, but I'll explain the meaning of this chart. Immigration has been the most substantial driver of population growth in recent years. Between 2007 and 2019, net overseas migration in Australia averaged 225,000 people per year, accounting for around 60% of total population growth. Now, shifting immigration flows over time has led to increasing migrant cultural and linguistic diversity. So shown in this figure, this is the proportion of the foreign-born population as a share of the total population, and the colours represent different countries or regions of birth. And so you can see it's grown in total from about 10% in 1947 to 30% or so in 2016, and is still around 30% in 2022. But what's really striking is this increasing mosaic towards these latter years, where as migration flows have shifted from Western Europe to Eastern Europe to West Asia, and now increasingly South and East and Southern Asia, it leaves a lasting imprint on the Australian population. We're all drawn from not just an immigrant country, but a country in which people are drawn from all corners of the world. So in 2021, if you were to select any two Australians at random from the population, there'd be approximately a 50% chance that they were born in different countries, a 2 in 3 chance that their mothers were born in 2 different countries, and a 2 in 5 chance, or 40% chance, that they speak different languages at home. And the diversity is increasingly widespread. In Sydney, there's around a 70% chance that if you randomly selected 2 people, they would speak different languages. However, the largest increases in diversity over the last 15 years have been in regional centres, places like Melton on the outskirts of Melbourne, Armidale, Alice Springs, Shepparton, Tamworth, Dubbo, Toowoomba, Wagga Wagga and Mildura. The most immigrant-rich communities remain concentrated in Sydney and Melbourne, and these communities are truly diverse. Some would even call them super diverse. People, they still continue to live in communities and form communities of people with similar backgrounds, like the Chinese community, for example, in Australia. But the wider communities in which they live are just incredibly diverse. And there's no real sense in which specific immigrant groups in Australia could be said to be residentially segmented or segregated into particular pockets of any given city. In Fairfield, in Western Sydney, for example, residents were born in more than 120 countries and speak more than 100 languages at home. One day it's my goal to try and prove that Fairfield is perhaps one of the most diverse places in the world. Now, ethnic diversity is a great asset to Australia. In the 2021 Mapping Social Cohesion survey, 86% of people said that multiculturalism has been good for Australia, and 77% said that accepting immigrants from many different countries has made Australia stronger. And this sentiment, if anything, has become stronger over time and likely contributes to social cohesion, evidenced, for example, by those high levels of trust we have globally. Now, this is pretty remarkable given the work of people like Robert Putnam and his research assistant, my now local member, who created this incredible body of research suggesting that ethnic diversity was in fact detrimental to trust and social cohesion. Even more remarkably, social cohesion in Australia actually increased during COVID-19 pandemic. As reported in last year's Mapping Social Cohesion survey, Australians reported a heightened sense of belonging and personal worth in 2020, heightened sense of acceptance of people from different backgrounds, and a greater sense of social inclusion and justice in Australia. So we had a bit of a galvanising response to the crisis. We pulled together. And that, as has already been alluded to, is also good for mental health and personal well-being. As our research has shown, neighbourhood social cohesion, even after accounting for all the other different characteristics of neighbourhoods, such as their level of economic disadvantage, was strongly protective of mental health, particularly against depression during Melbourne's second long lockdown. A kind of galvanising response is not without precedent. It makes intuitive sense, particularly in what we've heard around the response to flooding. Academic theories have long suggested that people band together during crises. But it is striking that social cohesion strengthened in Australia amidst global unrest, protest, polarisation, division, sharply polarised election outcomes, even just in the last 2 weeks, 4 or 5, both respect to the pandemic, the legacy of the pandemic, and these long-running social and political and economic issues. National level trends in social cohesion, though, of course, mask individual variation. And substantial variation across individuals and communities exist in the extent to which people trust one another, feel a sense of belonging and social cohesion in their communities, and feel the ability to engage and participate in their community life. Arguably, these reflect critical social inequalities that drag down national level cohesion. Economic inequality is the key driver and the largest driver of social inequalities, and by implication, social cohesion. As was shown in last year's Mapping Social Cohesion report, household finances are the single most important predictor of how people perceive cohesion in Australia. So people who are struggling to pay bills, who describe themselves as poor or just getting along, have a much lower sense of belonging in Australia, much more likely to be unhappy, perceive substantially weaker social cohesion and justice in Australia, are less likely to trust the government, more likely to disagree that multiculturalism has been good for Australia, and are more likely to report experiencing discrimination themselves. And financial stress and hardship has been increasing. Even before the pandemic, multiple indicators suggest that financial stress has been increasing. So the proportion of people who could not raise $2,000 in an emergency increased from 13% in 2006 to around 19% in 2020. The proportion who say they're poor, struggling, or just getting along increased from 30% in 2009 to 37% in 2019. Now, the government's response to the pandemic interrupted this trend for the better and reduced the level of financial stress. But the withdrawal of support and the emergence of cost of living and inflation pressures in 2022 means this is likely to be a temporary reprieve. Now, unsurprisingly, financial stress is concentrated in the most disadvantaged communities. The segmented nature of our housing markets is a big reason why. Greater affordability of housing in the more disadvantaged communities. But housing unaffordability still exists in these disadvantaged communities. And prior to the pandemic, 58% of low-income households who are renting were paying more than 30% of their income in rent. And almost 1 in 5, or 20% of people in the rental market, were paying more than 50%, more than half of their income just in rent. So traditionally, affordability stress has been particularly acute in the major cities. It would be no surprise to me if we discover that it's been spreading outwards in recent times and over the last year. The experience of financial stress in the major cities is also related to ethnic diversity. So much of the international research highlights an overlap between diversity and disadvantage. So disadvantaged communities diverse communities tend to be more disadvantaged. In Australia, it has been a little bit different, perhaps on account of the skilled migration program, student migration, and pretty good upward mobility for immigrants arriving in Australia. And so there are diverse communities, ethnically diverse communities, that are both reasonably affluent as well as relatively disadvantaged. Nevertheless, the most diverse communities in Australia also have relatively high levels of economic disadvantage. In fact, there are really no disadvantaged communities left in Sydney or Melbourne that aren't also ethnically diverse. And again, that affordability of housing is attractive for immigrants who don't have that same human capital. Now, diverse communities are cohesive and they are resilient places, but as Minister Lee's and formerly Professor Lee's research showed, it's not always well captured in survey data. Indeed, much of the international research suggests people living in diverse neighbourhoods and communities have a low sense of trust and cohesion in their local areas. The foreign-born population in Australia, for their part, actually have reasonably similar levels of trust in other people and in government as Australian-born populations. However, they tend to experience a lower sense of belonging in Australia and a lower sense of participation in community and social groups. Now, part of that is just because recently arrived immigrants tend not to have the same roots in Australia, those social connections. They tend to have shallower roots, which means they don't have those connections and tend to feel a lower sense of belonging and less engagement in their communities. Then at aggregate levels, diverse communities also experience higher rates of population churn because immigration is ongoing and people are coming into diverse communities continually. So there's a flow through of the population. And some of these communities, diverse communities, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, have experienced big change in their population over the last 20, 15 years, even as their populations remain very diverse. And this potentially makes it more difficult to establish and maintain lasting social cohesion and cohesion within their communities. Ethnically diverse and economically disadvantaged communities were also disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. At least up until the outbreak of Omicron in December last year, people in the most diverse communities in Sydney were almost 5 times more likely to have contracted COVID-19 than in the least diverse communities. More than twice as likely to be issued a fine or a court attendance notice by the police for breaching public health orders, despite the fact that they themselves report a high level of compliance with lockdown orders. And unemployment rates increased by an average of 2.3 percentage points at one point in the most diverse communities in Sydney, compared with very little change in the least diverse parts. And while we know vaccination rates were very high and rapidly caught up, especially in those diverse communities, the rollout of the vaccines was more than 1/3 slower in the most diverse communities. Overseas-born populations were at one point 3 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than the Australian population. And as I said at the top, in the disadvantaged communities, people were 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than the least disadvantaged communities. Now, the preliminary research of my colleagues and I suggests this impact is entirely due to economic structure and disadvantage of diverse communities, and particularly the exposure of the virus created by people in lower income households living and working in disadvantaged communities and essential occupations. So there's no evidence to suggest that cultural practices or large family or religious gatherings or anything like that itself played any role in the transmission of the virus. Now, that's counter to the media narratives and the public narratives that people in diverse communities are hearing. And some people are reporting to us that they're feeling vilified and discriminated against. And that is a real threat to social cohesion. So understanding these threats is a long-term project, and initial evidence suggests that people are resilient and are starting to bounce back. However, the emerging data also suggests that those positive impacts of the pandemic, or at least our community response to the pandemic, it was much stronger for Australian-born and English-speaking populations than it was for immigrant and non-English-speaking populations. So they didn't experience so much of this spike in social cohesion during the pandemic. So what next? Social cohesion is a big emerging issue around the world. It goes by different names, but almost everywhere we see a degree of social fracturing, division, polarisation, cultural wars, deeply polarised election outcomes, social and political process, all of which reflects on the harmony and cohesiveness of societies. Discord has been pretty muted in Australia, and we seem to have managed reasonably well. But things change quickly, and the seeds are there, most especially in the form of those social and economic inequalities. Maintaining social cohesion, let alone strengthening it, is a constant process. The job is never complete. And we need to be constantly addressing inequalities and the potential sources of discontent head-on to strengthen social cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was terrific. I can well understand why you've been chosen to lead that Scanlon report. I'm sure you'll do an excellent job in the coming years. Now, what I'd quite like to do, if I've got the capacity to do that, is to draw in some questions from the audience. Is that something that we can do? Is there microphones and so on? I think there's been a lot of talk from up here, so if anyone's got any questions, I think this would be a good opportunity. There's a person in the back row. Is there somebody with a microphone? Yes, thank you, sir.
Test.
And then the gentleman in the third row here. And maybe because it's been live streamed, should we ask people to identify themselves, Susan? Is that, yeah? So if you could identify yourself and then ask your question.
Thanks very much. I'm Louise Edwards from UNSW and also the Academy of Humanities. I've got a question for Professor Holden, colleague. I was really interested in the discussion about the economics of well-being and the costs that are often invisible to economic modelling. So, for example, you mentioned the relative cheapness of curriculum reforms compared to intensive tutoring for school changes, and I'm just sort of wondering whether that actually is because the labour of the teachers doing the curriculum reform is invisible to economists, and it's one of the reasons people are leaving teaching in droves. Even within universities, we see that, you know, that great idea at the department level becomes a cascade of work by the time it's actually rolled out as to the classroom. So people have to invent new scaffolding for their classes, they have to introduce new activities, they have to actually re-prepare all their classes, and teachers are actually sort of just spending all of this time, you know, because somebody in policy had a great idea, and lots of teachers are now kind of keen to actually become the department rather than be the coalface. So, you know, I think it's really important that the time that teachers spend is actually factored in, those teachers already employed, that the time they spend is actually factored into economic models and not sort of just part of this invisible labour. And just as a side anecdote, I have a friend who thinks, who is surprised at a gathering that people had to clean bathrooms. He said, "We don't clean our bathroom, it's always clean." He literally never saw his wife cleaning the bathroom, therefore it did not count. So we need to be careful that we don't do this to our teachers, because there will be no one left teaching. I hope.
Thanks, Louise. Richard.
Thanks for that, and that's an incredibly important point. The piece of research, which is not my work, but some scholars overseas I was referring to, did in fact take account on a fully costed basis of teacher time. I think the general point that you raised about making sure that we count all the contributions that people make and making sure that those contributions aren't invisible and aren't undervalued is incredibly important. I think on the specific question of teaching, one of the emerging and unfortunate trends has been the amount of time that teachers have to do, and this has been well documented, have to do in compliance and administration and reporting and other things, which take them away from what many of them got into the teaching profession to do, which is to spend time as educators, and what many of us as parents want for our children, which is for those teachers to be doing what they do best rather than filling in forms. So I think it's really important to think about what people do, measuring it correctly, and making sure we, you know, basically keep people doing what they want to do and what's most effective.
Alison, I'm interested in your response to that as the sort of policy person on the panel, not in necessarily in the specifics of the teaching, but of just what's counted and what's not in terms of, you know, the clever ideas that work their way through the system. I think there was reference in one of the, I forget whether it was you or Richard talking before about when you factored in public housing and public education, that meant that people were less disadvantaged. But,
yes,
you know,
that's right.
If they can't get access to public housing and the public education is not as good as it might be, it's not actually offsetting to the same degree as it may have been.
Yeah, that's right, definitely, and that's what I was referring to, consumption inequality, and demonstrating that there's in-kind services that are publicly available and ameliorate in some way the effect of income inequality. Certainly from the government's recent announcements and policies over the last 6 months, there's been a huge acknowledgement and redirection of funding towards social and affordable housing, and the recognition of housing as a fundamental need to address inequality and provide the foundation there for opportunity and engagement, economic and social participation. So that's a significant aspect of that that's become more pronounced in the last few months. There was one other aspect I was going to speak about there.
Education, housing.
I've lost my track. That's
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to take any other questions on where the government's focusing at the moment.
Yeah, sure. We'll come back to that. There's a gentleman in the third row, third seat along. Mr. Microphone person, whose name I don't know. Sorry. Yes, just down towards the front from the third row. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists. My name is Quan Lee from the University of New South Wales. My question here is around social cohesion, so maybe to James and then the panelists. When we look at social cohesion, I look at the example of Norway, I look at the example of Singapore, fantastic policies ensuring that the disadvantaged are not disadvantaged in terms of housing, and also housing is a very basic needs for all human beings. In Australia, it seems to be very expensive. You can't participate in voluntary work if you are struggling with living costs. And then on top of that, you are disadvantaged because if you don't have resources, you can't access private tutoring for education, so therefore you can't participate competitively into the social structures. What is it Australia doing wrong that Singapore and Norway is doing right? Something that comes to mind is the sovereignty fund. We have a sovereignty debt of $1 trillion. So if we switch it the other way around, what could we do to invest? And investments of social cohesion, which is an economic pathway, but participation and trust will eventually flow from that. And welcome your thoughts on that type of social fabric.
James, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but Kalinda, I'd be interested in your thoughts as well in terms of the sort of transfer discussion that you were raising as well. So James first.
No, I thought that was very well put, and I agree with everything that was said. Housing is emerging, has been over the last couple of years as one of the big issues that's coming up in our discussions with communities, and is likely an important part of that nexus between that financial stress and that financial well-being and economic disadvantage and their perceived social cohesion, as I was talking about in my address. So it having a real effect on social cohesion, even just things like housing policy and some of the housing affordability stress that is experienced particularly in disadvantaged communities. There are lots of ways that we can do about it. I don't think we've done particularly badly, but that's something that's emerged in the last couple of years as a big issue around housing affordability and addressing some of those issues around financial stress more generally. We saw a big response during the pandemic to some of the financial support measures, and that had a flow-through effect to people's perceptions of social cohesion in Australia. So we know a bit about what we can do and how we can address some of those issues, and I think they're going to become increasingly urgent over the next couple of years. So hopefully we can have a strong policy response.
Kalinda, did you?
There's been limited work on social cohesion in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and one of the main reasons for this is that it doesn't fit nicely in regards to communities working together to do what they need to do and the extreme disadvantage that people may experience, particularly in regional and remote communities. There's a lot of work, I think, that we need to do in terms of how we measure that social cohesion. There has been discussions across a couple of universities where we want to adapt a model of social cohesion, but ultimately it's not transferable at this point. So you might have a really strong community and culture and understanding, but they're still experiencing rheumatic heart disease, which, is a disease of extreme poverty that's only ever seen in nations that don't have access to healthcare. We still see it in Australia in remote communities as an example. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of how we better understand and address this within the complex environment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Thank you. One final question at the back there. I'm just trying to make up a bit of the time that we've lost. So, actually, sorry, we'll do two questions. I'll do the gentleman at the back and then the lady. Oh, I'm sorry, someone down here. We're going to have more questions. We're going to have questions all day, so we'll come to you. So we'll do the gentleman at the back and then we'll see how we're going for time. I'll make a judgment.
Thank you. My name is Raja Janankar from UNSW. There are lots of discussion about inequality from the panel, which is great, I think. One issue which wasn't mentioned, but perhaps alluded to by James, was the issue of unemployed people who tend to be coming from a socially disadvantaged group. People are long-term unemployed, again, a select group of that same group, and people who have repeat spells of unemployment. And that's an issue which affects maybe a small group of people, but they come from the same socially disadvantaged groups. Comments, thoughts? Thank you.
Yes, please. Yeah.
It's a really good point, and there's certainly a recognition that we need to do more. And in this, with the level of unemployment at the moment as well, we recognise that there's an enormous challenge and enormous opportunity to incentivise employment for people who have been unemployed for some time. But that's just not, here's the job, go and take it. It's required some quite active support to assist people to participate in those opportunities. And we've had references to housing and other things that are foundational and would be necessary for someone to actively engage in that employment opportunity. You also mentioned, the disadvantage associated with unemployment. But what we also know, of course, is from Peter Butterworth's studies at ANU and a range of other research, that if you don't have anxiety or depression when you go onto income support and become unemployed, you may likely have that, or you would more be likely have that 1 or 2 years after, in that there's this increased prevalence of mental health deterioration associated with longer term income support when people don't perceive and don't receive the opportunities that we need to make available to them. So there is a deep recognition then in government programs about the need to provide wraparound support to recognise the complexity and comorbidities of disadvantage and to ensure that it's not a single, as I spoke about, not a single programmatic service offer. Here's the job, why aren't you taking it? But the recognition of what other barriers might exist and a comprehensive service offer to genuinely assist people to engage with that.
I'll just add very briefly from a top-down level that, in important to those important points that Alison made, we've come to recognise, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years or so, that the speed limit of the economy in terms of unemployment isn't 5%, it's closer to 4%, and that if the kinds of reforms that have led us to that view can continue, we ought to be able to get that speed limit down to closer to 3.5% or 3%. That doesn't solve all those problems, but if you think about literally hundreds of thousands of people who, on average, in steady state are not unemployed, the best way for people to, not suffer from long-term unemployment is to be employed, more often and not be out of spells that tend to have a hysteresis effect to them and tend to perpetuate. And so those reforms are incredibly important for us to be able to provide those employment opportunities.
Kalinda.
I just want to speak to some of the work that we're doing in the Northern Territory. In the NT, about 50% of students don't complete high school and about 64% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aren't employed. And so we figured out that this was a pathway issue. And because of that, we developed a program, Menzies Roman Shoddy Training Centre, where we engage with students across a range of different mechanisms. The systems are there already to support people in regional and remote areas, but we want to be able to students to engage in that program. It's been running for about 2 years. We've had over 70 people come through, and they start at school age areas, or they can be undergrad and move into higher education as they progress with us as well. And we've been able to touch about 2,500 students so far, 2,800 students so far, and that's through engaging them in outsourcing. We've got a health lab that goes out to communities, and they know what options and availability there is for them in terms of training and education. We are trying to gain support from government at this point in time, but what we realised is that this isn't necessarily just we need to get people into jobs. We need to have those systems that can work in those environments to grow people on the ground, to support them in those communities. And so, you know, working with distance education as part of the Department of Education to make sure that people are able to access those services that are there for them. It's really very simple, but at the same time, it's quite a complicated process to be able to engage all of those partners. But that's just one way in which we can address some of these issues, particularly in regional and remote areas.
James, did you want to add anything to that?
I agree with everything that has been said so far.
Very good.
It's difficult to pick up in surveys.
Yes.
The impact of you know, long-term unemployment and cyclical unemployment.
Yeah.
And so it's something that we need more research on. But I agree with all the points made.
Did you want to say something else? No? Okay. Okay, I'm going to end this session now because we're going to have lots of times for lots of more questions. I'd like to thank our panellists. I mean, I think what we've managed to do in this session is to go from a very big picture down to a granularity which is, with no disrespect to your work, Richard, much more complex than you get in the big picture pattern, and to see how that might play out, which is we're now going to pick up in various other sessions. So please join me in thanking our panellists.